priest burned alive, a church turned into a mass grave, and 3 nuns accused of war crimes. This isn't just another case of violence during war. This is something far more disturbing. What happened inside the Sovu convent during the Rwandan genocide? And why did the Vatican try to bury the truth? A church is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of peace, of safety. But what if I told you that for thousands of people seeking refuge, their church became a death trap? That for some, their last prayers weren't heard by God, but by the very people who would send them to their deaths. This is the story of Sister Gertrude Mukangango and Sister Maria Kisito, 2 nuns who stood trial for one of the most horrifying betrayals in modern history. These were women of faith, women who had sworn to serve God and protect the innocent. And yet, they were accused of handing over their own people to be butchered, of fueling the fires that burned hundreds alive, of murdering a priest who tried to stop them. But here's the question. Did they kill out of fear, or were they part of something much bigger? And what's even more terrifying, could this have happened elsewhere? Stay with me, because this story takes a turn no one expected. Rwanda, April 1994. The sun sets over rolling green hills, casting a golden glow over the land. It looks peaceful, but this peace is a lie. Because right now, the streets are drenched in blood. The country has erupted into one of the most brutal genocides in history. The Interahamwe militia, Hutu extremists, are hunting down the Tutsi people like animals. They move door to door, dragging people out of their homes. Their weapons, machetes, guns, fire. Their mission, wipe out the Tutsi minority. Imagine this. You're a Tutsi civilian. You've just watched your neighbors get hacked to death in the street. Your house burned to the ground. Your family missing or already dead. There's only one place left to run. The Sovu Convent. A church, a sanctuary, a place of God. Or at least that's what you believe. You rush inside, joining thousands of others, crying, praying for mercy. And then the doors close behind you. You don't realize it yet, but you've just walked into a death trap. The people in the church weren't alone. They weren't just hiding from the killers. They were hiding with them, because the very nuns they trusted had already chosen a side. Sister Gertrude Mukangango and Sister Maria Kisito held the keys to the convent. And when the Interahamwe militia arrived, they didn't turn them away. They let them in. And that wasn't all. Witnesses later claimed that these nuns women sworn to protect the innocent did something unthinkable. They pointed out hiding places. They locked the church doors to keep people trapped inside. And worst of all, they helped light the fire that burned hundreds alive. But why? What could have made women of faith commit such monstrous acts? Were they forced to comply, or did they do it willingly? Imagine being one of them, one of the thousands who had fled to the Sovu convent, believing it was a sanctuary, believing the nuns in their white habits were protectors, guardians of the faith. But faith meant nothing here. The Interahamwe militia had surrounded the church. The air was thick with the stench of death. And then the first gunshot rang out. Screams, chaos. Grenades exploded against the church walls, tearing holes into the building. Shards of stained glass rained down on the people huddled inside, praying, clutching their children. Some tried to run, but the doors had been locked. By whom? By the nuns. They watched, silent, expressionless, holding the keys to what was now a mass grave. And then the fire started. Flames erupted, engulfing the wooden beams, spreading to the pews, to the bodies. The heat choked the air, turning screams into guttural wails, mothers clutching their children, fathers throwing themselves against the doors, screaming for mercy. But there was no mercy here. There was only fire. And yet Sister Gertrude stood there, watching, silent, unmoved. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. Why? If she had truly been forced to do this, if she had been a victim herself, why didn't she run? And more importantly, why did she hand over more victims the next day? Now, here's where things get dark, because there was one man inside the convent who refused to stay silent. A man who had seen what was happening, who had opposed the nuns' betrayal. Father Jean-Francois Kayaranga. He was a priest in the Sovu convent, and he did something no one else dared to do. He spoke out. He pleaded for the refugees' lives. He stood up to Sister Gertrude, and then he disappeared. No one saw where he went. No one knew what had happened until they found his body, burned beyond recognition. The only thing left intact, his charred cross still hanging from his neck, and the last people seen with him, Sister Gertrude, Sister Maria. Now tell me, was his death a warning, or was it proof that the nuns were far more involved than anyone realized? Because if they could murder a priest, what else were they capable of? The flames had swallowed the church whole. Bodies were reduced to ash, their last cries swallowed by the roar of the inferno. Smoke rose into the sky, darkening the heavens above the Sovu convent. And yet, some survived, burned, broken, but alive. And when they finally spoke, their words changed everything. One woman, her voice barely above a whisper, told investigators, "The nuns, they gave them the gasoline." Let that sink in. They didn't just stand by. They didn't just watch. They helped. They chose to hand over the fuel. They chose to be part of the massacre. But here's the question. Were they acting on their own, or was someone giving them orders? Because this is where things get disturbing. The Catholic Church had a deep involvement in Rwandan politics. Some priests and nuns harbored Tutsi refugees, while others betrayed them. So were Sister Gertrude and Sister Maria just two rogue nuns? Or were they part of something much, much bigger? The genocide ended, but Rwanda was left in ruins. Entire villages wiped off the map. Hundreds of thousands dead. Mass graves scattered across the country. The world finally turned its eyes to the horrors that had unfolded. And the hunt for those responsible began. But guess what happened to Sister Gertrude and Sister Maria? They weren't arrested. They weren't held accountable. They fled to Belgium, and no one stopped them. Not the Rwandan government, not the Catholic Church, not the United Nations. Why? Who protected them? Who made sure that these women responsible for mass murder were safe and untouched? And more importantly, why did the Vatican stay silent? Because here's what no one wants to talk about. The Catholic Church had powerful connections in Europe. And this wouldn't be the first time the Church had helped war criminals escape justice. Could this be another cover-up? Or did someone inside the Vatican know more than they let on? For 7 years, they were free women. 7 years of silence. 7 years of hiding behind their habits. But justice finally caught up to them. Belgium, where the nuns had fled, finally took action. Sister Gertrude Mukangango and Sister Maria Kisito were charged with war crimes. It was historic. For the first time ever, Catholic nuns were prosecuted for genocide. And the evidence, overwhelming. Survivors took the stand. They described in horrifying detail how the nuns had handed over Tutsi civilians to the militia, locked the church doors, trapping them inside, supplied the gasoline that set them on fire, But when Sister Gertrude and Sister Maria were asked to explain themselves, they didn't confess. They didn't break down in guilt. Instead, they gave one chilling response. We were just following orders. Whose orders? Was it the Hutu extremists, the Catholic Church, or was it something even deeper than that? Because if these nuns weren't acting alone, who else had blood on their hands? The courtroom was silent, the world watched, and then the judge looked them in the eye and said, guilty. 15 years for Sister Gertrude, 12 years for Sister Maria. It was meant to be a victory for justice. But was it? Because here's the part that no one talks about. What about the Vatican? The Catholic Church had operated in Rwanda for decades. They had influence, power, control. So how deep did this go? Did the Vatican know about the nuns' crimes and choose to stay silent? Or worse, did they help them escape? And if they did, what else are they hiding? The trial had ended. The verdict was clear. Sister Gertrude Mukangango and Sister Maria Kisito were convicted of genocide. But something was missing. One voice, one of the most powerful voices in the world, never spoke. The Vatican, the Pope, the Catholic Church, silence. No condemnation, no apology, no acknowledgement that two of their own had been found guilty of mass murder. Why? Why refuse to speak on a case so historically significant? Unless they already knew the truth. Unless they knew that if they spoke, more secrets would come spilling out. So instead, they chose to bury it, just like they had done so many times before. Which brings us to the real question. Was this an isolated case or part of a much bigger pattern? Because history tells us this wouldn't be the first time the church had protected criminals. Think about this. This wasn't the first time the Catholic Church had been accused of shielding war criminals. Not even close. Did you know? After World War II, hundreds of Nazi officers and war criminals escaped justice. And do you know who helped them flee Europe? The Vatican. Using a secret network of Catholic priests, war criminals were given new identities, fake passports, and a safe passage to South America. And these weren't just any Nazis. These were some of Hitler's top men. Men who had orchestrated massacres, gas chambers, and human experiments. And yet, the Vatican helped them escape. Now, let's fast forward to Rwanda. Two nuns convicted of genocide. And somehow they managed to flee to Belgium and evade capture for years. So ask yourself, did Sister Gertrude and Sister Maria have the same protection? Did the Catholic Church help them escape justice, just like they helped the Nazis? And if they did, what else have they covered up? Because if they could protect war criminals, murderers, and genocidal priests, what other sins are hidden inside the Vatican's walls? This wasn't the first time the Catholic Church had been accused of protecting war criminals. Far from it. If you think the Church's silence on Sister Gertrude and Sister Maria was strange, wait until you hear what they've done before. Because this has happened before. Did you know? After World War II, dozens of high-ranking Nazi officers, men guilty of war crimes, human experimentation, and genocide vanished. And do you know who helped them escape? The Vatican. Using a secret network known as the Rat Lines, the Catholic Church helped war criminals flee Europe, providing them with new identities, false documents, and safe passage to South America. Men like Adolf Eichmann, one of the masterminds behind the Holocaust. Men like Joseph Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death. Men who should have stood trial and faced justice. But instead, they boarded Vatican-backed ships and disappeared. Now, fast forward to Rwanda. Two nuns, convicted of genocide. And yet, somehow, they evade capture for years. Somehow, they find shelter in Belgium. Who helped them? Did they use the same network of protection as Nazi war criminals? Did the Vatican quietly arrange their escape just as they had done before? And if they did, what does that say about the true power of the Church? And more importantly, what else have they covered up? Because if mass murder isn't enough to force the Vatican to act, then what is? Now that you know the story, tell me. What do you believe? Were the nuns just pawns in a larger game forced to comply, driven by fear? Or were they cold-blooded killers who knew exactly what they were doing? Did they act out of fear? Or did they willingly take part in one of history's worst genocides? And the biggest question of all, if the Catholic Church really helped war criminals escape before, how many others have they protected? How many more killers are still out there, hiding behind the walls of the Vatican? Because one thing is certain, the truth didn't die in that fire. It's still out there. And maybe the Vatican never wanted us to find it.